Okay, nostalgia trappers, let's do this. My name is David Parsons. Thanks for tuning into the program. I hope you enjoy what we've got for you today. Today we're talking about housing and gentrification. Honestly, no other subject makes me feel the ripoff of capitalism more than thinking about housing and rent and landlords. I don't know about you, but I've been renting my entire adult life. I fork over a huge portion of the money I earn every month to some fucking landlord that doesn't have a job or contribute in any way. It makes me sick, and it honestly makes me really feel the whole of why I hate capitalism in a way that none of my Marx books or anything like that can communicate. And I wonder if that's recognizable to you. Our guest today, Sam Stein, is someone who's done a lot of thinking about housing, about gentrification, particularly in New York City. He's got a book called Capital City, Gentrification and the Real Estate State. And the reason why Sam caught my eye lately is because he's got a piece in the Baffler called Faulty Tower. I have all this linked in the episode description, by the way. You can check it all out. But Faulty Tower, this piece in the Baffler is about, you know, how in the midst of us all struggling to pay rent and watching everybody else struggle to find, you know, decent housing, watching these fucking luxury condominiums and towers be built in cities and towns across the United States, it's incredibly frustrating, and it's something that Sam writes about really, really eloquently and in a lot of detail. I feel like I learned a ton from this episode and conversation, so I hope you enjoy it and go check out his stuff and understand that housing really is a place where we all feel capitalism in maybe a different way than in other realms. And I thought it would be important to talk about on the program again. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. And please go join our Patreon, patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We're doing a lot of fun stuff for subscribers lately, but I'm especially excited to be starting our movie club this Friday, November 19th. All of our subscribers will be getting a Zoom link to come and talk about the movie The Night of the Hunter with Robert Mitchum, which came out in 1955. And believe me when I say, links up beautifully with the things we talk about here on Nostalgia Trap. So I hope you will join the Patreon and come join our little movie club. That's at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Thank you to all the subscribers who keep this thing going, and enjoy this conversation. Here is me and housing policy oracle, Sam Stein. All right, we're going. How's it going, Sam Stein? Good to see you.
Pretty good. Good to see you too.
I realized, talking with our mutual friend Andrew Schustek, that you are a Graduate Center alumni as well. You were there, you just said, what, 2015 to 2020?
Yeah, I think those are the dates.
Were you in the geography department?
Yeah, I was in geography, which is housed within earth and environmental sciences, which makes me sound like I'm more competent in more things than I actually am.
I was going to say, am I talking to a STEM person right now? But no, I don't think so. You wrote a book, and I'd love to talk to you about it. I think that when I emailed you, I was responding specifically, and I want to say the name of your book before we even get started. The name of your book is Capital City, Gentrification and the Real Estate State. I love that. And before we got started, just saying it sounds like the name of a canonical history book that you would find on your orals list. It's one of those. When I heard like the title of Current Affairs, I didn't realize Current Affairs was just like some magazine that some dude started in his bedroom in Brooklyn. I thought it was something that had been around for 50 years. So
I thought it was like that entertainment show. Wasn't there like a show like Entertainment Tonight that was also called Current Affairs, something like that?
I think it was Current Affair with Maury Povich.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, I totally remember that. It was like
it's right?
Yeah, the 90s, there was the era of like hard copy. Remember hard copy?
Yeah,
like
yeah.
All the it was like the forerunners to like TMZ and all that sort of stuff. It was like that was the tabloid.
Respectable TMZ.
Yeah, it was. I really mainly like you came to my attention because of this awesome piece that I want everyone to read in the Baffler, which is called Faulty Towers. And I wrote to you last week. Thanks for coming on the show, Sam, because I wrote to you last week because I was telling you that I worked at the New York Historical Society on Central Park West for years and years in the late 2010s, I guess, and I watched this building go up on the other corner of Central Park, of 57th Street, I guess it is. And you've written a piece that's about this ridiculous building that's like this. I mean, I call them the skinny towers. They're like these like really skinny glass luxury apartment condo places. But your piece actually gets into like what these things are and why they're important. I mean, when did you first notice these skinny towers? Because I feel like when I tell the story of my time in New York City, it like kind of corresponds to this moment in gentrification and the skyline changing that you're trying to describe here.
Yeah, I mean, this whole place is now known as Billionaires Row, West 57th, plus or minus a few blocks south of Central Park, where you've got this stretch of, you call them what, skinny towers? They call themselves super thins.
Wow.
And it's like a competition for who can have the highest ratio between, the thinnest to the tallest tower. I first remember thinking about them when I was I was at Hunter College. I wasn't a student there. I was doing some work with Peter Kwong, who was a kind of critical historian of Chinatown. And we were trying to write a book together about the gentrification of Chinatown that sadly we couldn't continue. He died during that project. But we were in his office, which looked out over, among other things, the first of those towers, 157th. And he had a way of, getting straight to it. And he just looked out and said, "This is bullshit."
Well, yeah, I mean, it's bullshit for like 80 different reasons. I mean, one of them is just that like 5 people live in these things. But like something you point out is this sort of like ratio of spaces and sort of like what a common high-rise building would be in a typical American city. And then the ratio here, which ends up with basically like what? There's like one apartment per floor, basically, right? Like you don't really have next door neighbors.
Sometimes less.
Yeah.
Some of these ones are, and this is part of the super thin thing, right? They make them ultra thin, and then you have like a 3-story penthouse, and you have no neighbors around you. And the emptiness that you brought up is key. It's a selling point for the condo buyers. They don't want anybody there. They don't necessarily want to be there. And there's 2 kinds of emptiness going on. One is people buy it and then don't live there. It's just like one of several investment properties, and maybe they spend their life flying from, Vancouver to New York City to, I don't know, Sao Paulo or someplace else where they have these condos and they live, the good life. Or they never set foot in them at all and they just flip them. Then there's another kind of emptiness, which is there's just not that many apartments in these buildings. So the latest one to go up, which is the focus of that article, Faulty Towers, I think the one that you were looking at going up, 111 West 57th Street. And if I remember right, it's an 84-story building with only 60 condos.
Jesus.
And something like 14 of them are in another building. And so the building itself has even fewer than 46 condos, which is like less than you would have in a new law tenement built in 1920 on like the corner of any New York City block. That would be 5 stories. They would have 50 apartments in them. This 84-story building has less. So it has the appearance of like dense urban living and all that stuff. But the fact is, A, nobody lives there because even after they buy it, they don't live there. And even if it was fully occupied, it would be nothing compared to, any other tall building that was built in years prior.
Right. I mean, that's the kind of absurdity of it. Is understanding that there's 4 billionaires maybe living in these buildings that define the visual landscape. I mean, really, New York was one thing when I moved there in 2003, and it was something else when I moved away in 2018. It was like it became Dubai in a lot of ways, and it's sort of like what I mean by that is both political and architectural, if that makes sense. This sort of like billionaire playland of glass, skinny buildings that I don't have any access to, and nobody I know has any access to. But what you do in your piece is sort of show us what the political economy of this and like how these buildings came to be. Can you tell us a little bit of sort of why they're a problem for democracy? I mean, I think that's kind of the general thesis you're getting at. Correct me if I'm wrong. Is that
no? I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's about what kind of a city are we building and who is it building for?
Right.
You can contrast this, first of all, super glitzy, ultra high rise glass and steel towers, but also extremely under occupied housing with the way that most New Yorkers live, which is like fairly dense and crowded. And we kind of like it. And that's kind of what it is to be a New Yorker. But then also, like 1 in 5 New Yorkers is overcrowded. And some of that is extremely dangerous. Mm. So as I was writing the article, I think, or certainly conceiving of it, we had that Hurricane Ida.
Yep.
And we had flooding in all over New York City, not caused by rising sea levels, but just caused by incredibly intense rain, which is another symptom of climate change. And something like 11 people died. And those people were stuck in basement apartments. There's probably hundreds of thousands around the city. There's one estimate that says 300,000. There's another that says 100,000, somewhere between there. These are, mostly informal conversions. And so we don't have an accounting for it. But in any case, people are crowded into these underground housing, multiple families living there, and they're trapped. They're not built safely to get out of. And so you have this sort of extreme overcrowding, density, dangerous conditions in the exact same city as you have an intense amount of development built for nobody to live in. So I guess that's the undemocratic nature, is like it has nothing to do with the needs of the city. It has nothing to do with the wants of the people of the city. And it doesn't even have to do much with even this elite class who's going to live in the city. It's mostly geared toward a very small number of people who want to invest and also not pay their taxes.
Right. I think that's part of what I was getting at, is that these aren't just the forces that built these buildings aren't the rich people that live in them. There's something like these buildings seem like they're part of a policy, and a policy that's tied to how New York builds affordable housing, as absurd as that sounds. And that was one of the surprises for me, is reading the details from your work. I think both in your book and in this Baffler piece recently, is sort of uncovering how can you explain that basically, like, these real estate, I mean, it's a long story, and it's about investment and disinvestment, all that kind of things. But these real estate companies are and developers are benefiting from specific policies in New York City about affordable housing, right?
Some of them are, yeah.
Yeah.
So the first one that got built, that 157, the one Peter Kwong looked at and said, this is bullshit.
Right.
That one got a tax break that we generally call 421A, which is technically known as the Affordable New York Program. This is the most unaffordable housing you can imagine. Got the Affordable New York Program, and it gives them something like $66 million in tax breaks, which means that the owners of them are not paying taxes for I forget if it was 15 or 25 years in that case of that building, but a long time. And in exchange, the developers paid somebody else to build a 66-unit affordable housing complex in the Bronx. So, okay, we need affordable housing. The Bronx needs affordable housing, but a couple things. First of all, you're basically legislating separate and unequal development, where the poor people live in the Bronx and the rich people live in Manhattan. Second of all, that's a lot of money to be spending for not a lot of affordable housing. It comes out to something like over $900 million per apartment in subsidy. If we say that the point of giving $65 million over 10 years to 157 is to get these 66 units, that's what it works out to. Meanwhile, it costs, about $200,000 a unit to actually build the affordable housing. So the city could spend the same amount of money building a lot more affordable housing, but instead we give a tax break to a developer and allow them to pay some third party to build it. It's this absurd Rube Goldberg thing. And it's not even the most absurd Rube Goldberg affordable housing program. The main one we have in this country is the low-income housing tax credit, which is an absurd mechanism to build affordable housing, where basically large banks and corporations pay nonprofits to build housing so that they don't have to pay taxes through credits that are given by the federal government to the state government to a syndicator, and they go all out, and money gets lost at every every level. So instead of just building the damn thing, building public housing, building social housing, building even just straightforward non-profit affordable housing, financing it directly, we go through these other mechanisms, and the richest people in the world get to profit from it at every step.
Well, I understood how that was happening during the Bloomberg administration, because Bloomberg was pretty much open about being a neoliberal or someone who was very very much into bringing big business and capital into the city. How does De Blasio sell these same set of programs? Because he's sort of like, I mean, he's at the end of a very sort of embarrassing set of terms, but either way, he came into office selling a very progressive vision of the city. How do they sell these towers as buying us anything? Because it sounds like what you're describing is that we're getting ripped off here, and we could build affordable housing a lot cheaper.
Certainly. De Blasio didn't really have to do anything for this model to keep going. The rules are written. Some of it is written at the state level, too. That 421A tax break is written at the state level, even though it applies to the city. And so a liberal politician who wants to keep the investment capital flowing can sort of wash their hands of it and say, "Ugh, New York State, Albany, am I right?"
Yeah.
But, de Blasio did actually fight to extend 421A. It came up for renewal under his term. The housing movement was saying, "Fuck this, let it expire, kill the bill. Let's do a new program that's going to spend that kind of money on, genuine housing for the people." De Blasio's response was, "No, we need this. Let's sort of make a few technical changes that, for example, it's harder to do condos in the middle of Manhattan now. It's going to have to be rentals. The affordable housing should be on-site, not off-site." This all sounds good, right? Except they also allowed the income ranges for the affordable housing to go as high as 130% of the area median income.
Oof.
Which means that's like the 20th percentile, or the richest 20% of New Yorkers gets to access this affordable housing.
How does that sounds like it's not going to change the situation in those basements?
Yes, exactly right. Nobody is leaving the basements and moving into the new 421A towers, and they also extended the length of it, so now it's a 35-year tax break.
Jesus.
But, we don't do good planning in this city, in this country, but yet we're giving a 35-year tax break to luxury developers in exchange for some very unaffordable housing. De Blasio did all sorts of other things, which we can credit him for, but he continued this mode of subsidizing real estate capital in order to get any kind of public benefit in exchange. And so in the book, I talked about it as basically continuity despite change. There is substantial change between Bloomberg and de Blasio on all sorts of things, but there's this sort of core to it that doesn't change.
How does this fit in? I thought this was an interesting point that you made in your Faulty Towers piece in the Baffler about. It was something that I was hearing about, and I think thinking about a lot when I was in New York, was just because I'm from the suburbs. So it's like the suburbanization of New York City. And I remember thinking a lot about how, because I used to walk on 23rd Street to my job at Brute College, and there's a Home Depot on 23rd Street. And there's a lot of just really everything is just, big box stores and the type of places that I would go in the suburbs. And it felt like, well, why am I here? The whole reason I came to New York City was because I wanted to enjoy the fabric of New York City culture, and instead I'm passing by, literally on 23rd Street, there's a Home Depot and an Outback Steakhouse. And those were just sort of the consumer ends of that. But part of what you identify as sort of the suburban impulse of space, and the sort of high rise being a place that duplicates the gated communities of the suburbs. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it seems like a lot of this is sort of, I don't know if this is inadvertent or what, but it seems like a lot of the city planning is sort of attacking the fabric of New York City culture and sort of turning the city into a neoliberal suburb.
Yeah, as you were describing that, I was searching my bookshelf for this book that came out, I think, during the Bloomberg years, that was called The Suburbanization of New York City.
That's probably where I got that phrase.
I mean, and it was happening. And Michael Sorkin, who is a great architect and architecture critic, had a piece in there about basically the area you're talking about. I think he was talking about Broadway in that range as basically a mall now.
Yeah, on the way down to Union Square, right there for sure.
Yeah, exactly. It's all this big box retail, but it's housed in what are essentially former manufacturing buildings. And so that was like kind of his way of talking about the transformation of the New York City and American and global economy through these buildings that don't change, structurally, but the use changes. Mm-hmm. In terms of the residential aspect, you do have various kinds of suburbanization and anti-urban impulse. The kind that I'm talking about in Faulty Towers and that we're seeing in a tower like 111 West 57th is a vertical sprawl.
Yeah.
It's not the same as horizontal sprawl. It's not taking over a wider and wider swath of the city necessarily, but it's the same development pattern upward. And then as that becomes a successful model, you have more and more of it. And then it becomes horizontalized. Right along the stretch of West 57th, you have all these towers, which themselves are vertical sprawl. So what is vertical sprawl? It's suburban style single family homes stacked on top of each other.
Jesus.
So in 111 West 57th, you have no neighbors around you. You have neighbors above and below you. But because there's nobody around you, and all the walls are glass, you have the visual appearance of being on your own. No neighbors to worry
Super spooky. You sent me the photo set of that brilliant artist who basically she's a Hungarian woman who posed as a billionaire to convince the real estate companies to show her and let her into these apartment spaces, and she was able to sort of covertly take photos. And the photos are super creepy. They're like really lonely pictures.
Yeah, absolutely. And listeners should check out the book. It's called Private Views, and the artist is Andy Schmid. It is a brilliant thing that like only one person is going to be able to get away with, because I'm sure they're going to be more careful about background checks now. But
it's crazy that she just like invented a persona as a billionaire and was able to con her way into these places.
One of the funniest things about it for me is that she also has a fake husband who's a friend of hers, who really is like a rare book and art dealer in Europe, and like doesn't earn a ton of money, but the real estate people think that that's an obscure enough profession that you could be a billionaire.
Yeah,
you could make $1 billion selling rare manuscripts.
Yeah, it's you're just like an Amazon bookseller, but you can just say, "Yeah, I do rare manuscripts," and people think you're a billionaire. Yeah, wow.
So she got into these buildings and took the photos, and they're so sterile, they're so lonely, and then she also recorded the real estate agents giving the pitch, and often the pitch is, "There's nobody around. You're on your own. Nobody really lives here." Andy said in her character as Gabriella, she said that she was actually going to live there full time, and the agents are always surprised, and they tell her, "Well, you don't have to worry about bumping into awkward neighbors in the hallway." There is no hallway.
Such an unbelievable like change in the way you would think of New York City or a city at all. Like the idea of you will be alone here, because that's exactly how the suburbs, have always been envisioned as sort of getting away from the city. So this is like lonely suburbs, the lonely housewife in the suburbs, up in a giant skinny tower in the sky in Manhattan. Really striking idea, honestly. It's disturbing.
Overlooking the city, right? So you have this view that the rest of us will never experience for more than like half an hour after paying $40 to go to the top of the Empire State Building or something. That's your private view. And so that's the experience that they're selling. It is isolated. It is probably for people who are terrified of other people, possibly for good reason.
The soaking tub is a common feature. Every one of these apartments has like this tub that overlooks the city, like right by this giant, floor to ceiling glass window. And you kind of the idea of it's very Mr. Burns on The Simpsons. It's very like like the lonely rich person soaking themselves in the sky.
Right, and it's totally ubiquitous. Every single one of them has this. They're all like bean shaped, and they're about a foot away from a floor to ceiling window. And they must assume that no one can see them, right?
Right.
But as more and more of these towers go up, they're going to be staring at each other in these so-called private spaces. And that's one reason why the price of them is actually starting to come down a little bit, is it's not quite as an exclusive a proposition as it was when there were only one or two of these buildings, now that there's a dozen of them on the row. But
what are the price range on these, by the way? Something like in your article, I think you said the cheapest one was $9 million in that particular tower.
Yeah, that's what I'm remembering too. Is $9 million was the cheapest. I can't remember what the most expensive one, but we're talking about tens of millions of dollars. The most expensive one was like 90 something million. That's been sold on this row.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about those towers, I don't think of them as like robust engines of humanity in the city. They're like a sign of something so dark and so far from the vision of what a city could be. I mean, I'm thinking about I've taught this class for a few years now about the American suburbs and the history of the suburbs. And I use this book by Dolores Hayden, The Building of Suburbia, and it goes through these like historic landscapes of different types of ideas that people had about basically escaping the city. And you know, the 20th century element of it that enters into, I guess, maybe in the 60s and 70s is this idea of the new urbanism, and how that became a movement in architecture, but also in politics too. The notion that like we'd fucked up in the suburbs somehow, and we created something that's like isolated and alienating, and like there's no longer a downtown, and you know we just go to the mall, and our kids are depressed, and it was supposed to be a move towards like having lively downtowns and walking cities and things like that. Where is the new urbanism conversation now, particularly when it comes to New York City? Because it feels like the city isn't trying to do that at all. At the same time, you have like, I don't know, when I think about new urbanism in New York City, I think about they've closed off certain streets, right? Like they did that at Baruch College, actually, when I was there. They closed off the street and make it like there are like little pieces of it happening. I don't know. What do you think of that?
I think it's kind of both simultaneously.
Yeah.
There's another book by another CUNY Grad Center fellow that I'm reaching for but not finding, that was called Building Like Moses with Jacobs in Mind. And that was the tagline for the Bloomberg Urban Planning Department. That they were going to build like Robert Moses, but do it while keeping Jane Jacobs in mind. And they were going to like finally resolve the contradiction. And like, you know, a deeper look at the two of them shows that neither is really a model that we should necessarily be pursuing blindly, and that just sort of resolving them doesn't produce a great city either. But they were trying to kind of do both. And people who are, progressive urbanists liked certain things about the Bloomberg years, like those open streets, like an expansion of the bike lanes, like new rapid bus lines that his transportation commissioner put in, but it was all at the same time as a kind of mega development and a pattern of zoning that I wrote about in Capital City, where you basically upzone poor areas and manufacturing districts and allow for luxury development there. And then you downzone high income, white, basically semi-suburban areas within the city. And that was a way of sort of keeping two forms of real estate capital happy: the homeowners and the developers, all at the expense of people who are actually seeking affordable places to live permanently,
right?
Especially non-speculative ways of living in the city. You know, more and more foreclosed.
A question that came up that I don't know if you can answer, but it seems like it's something you're getting at, which is sort of like, and it especially came out during the pandemic, but it's something that's been building for a while, which is this contradiction between, you know, building all this luxury shit that sits empty while homelessness gets like worse and worse. And you see like people on the street. I mean, I'm in Southern California, so like LA is just insane. Like the tent cities that exist in LA are just honestly unbelievable. Nothing like I've ever seen. I've been around LA my whole life. So watching that happen at the same time they're building these like luxury towers, there's an insane contradiction there. And like, I think we brought this up on the show a while back when the pandemic was just starting. There were homeless people in Las Vegas at the same time that all the hotels were closed and were empty. And so you had all these like hotel rooms just sitting there. And the city said absolutely not. And the city ended up setting up an outdoor shelter situation in a fucking parking lot at the base of these luxury like hotels, not even luxury, just hotels with like thousands of rooms. How does that happen? And like, how is it just that just is an impossible proposition in our society to open those rooms up to homeless people? And that I think you could also tell us a little bit about how it has happened actually in some cases, right? Like there are areas where that is happening.
Right. I mean, the fastest thing to say is in a capitalist system and in our constitutional order, property rights are valued higher than human rights. That's the one sentence.
It's tough to swallow, but that's I mean,
that's how it is, right? Like that's why we need to change this.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of that specific issue, you had a crisis in the hotel industry, right? They weren't getting a lot of tourists for months. Even New York City is not back to full capacity of hotels. Meanwhile, you had a lot of people homeless before the pandemic, and then a lot of people thrown into housing precarity when they lost their jobs if the eviction moratorium didn't catch them. And not every place had a real eviction moratorium. The federal one had all sorts of loopholes. So the system is not set up to actually provide for adequate and decent housing for everybody. That's been made more clear over the course of the pandemic, like a lot of inequalities were. There were places that advanced a program for usually the state to buy up hotels and convert them into housing for the homeless. And California was actually a leader in that. I don't know just how successful it was, but they did it and they did it fast. Oregon did it as well. Vermont did it. I worked on a bill in New York State to do something like that. And we passed the bill, but they haven't actually done it. They are sitting on $100 million that was allocated to buy empty hotels or maybe office buildings and convert them into good housing. And we put in all sorts of things. It has to be, rent stabilized forever if it's in New York City, and it has to be affordable to low-income people, and half of it should go to homeless people. It shouldn't be shitty housing, so it has to have at least a kitchenette in every and a private bathroom. We set up the infrastructure to do it, but so far it's not happened.
Who are the people who are resisting this? Because it seems like, there's the obvious, forces of capital, but it feels like, there's something, and this is something that, growing up in the suburbs, I've been so depressed about, is sort of like the settler culture that is baked into the homeowner sort of ideology is like very much about in other words, it's not just real estate agents or real estate companies that are into private property. It's homeowners are really. It goes to this idea of why affordable housing is just something that everyone turns their nose. Like no matter how progressive they are, if you tell people that you want to build affordable housing near them, they don't want that, right?
A lot of the time, yeah. So the homeowner politics are pretty revolting a lot of the time. It's frankly something I wish I spent more time on in my book, but because I was thinking so much about New York City, I wasn't always thinking about that context. A quarter of New York City is zoned for single family homes, but it doesn't dominate the conversation in the way that it does in a lot of California and in most of the country for that matter. And there was a whole discourse when we started subsidizing single family home ownership in the suburbs that this was going to be a conservatizing force. And I think the way that it was thought of at the time was mostly around labor politics. I forget who it was, but maybe it was Henry Ford or some other bastard said, if you have a mortgage, you're not going to go on strike. Like you have too much to lose.
Yeah.
And that, it wasn't entirely successful. People do still go on strike if they have mortgages, but it changes the way that you think about risk. And it changes the way
you think about politics too. When I hear that, Jesus, because I'm like, I think that there's truth to that, and there are obviously some complications to that too. But it just asks this question pops into my head about the larger left project is sort of what if it achieves success. Then you have a bunch of people with mortgages or property or investments in a system that make them not really want to be progressive anymore. There's a natural you lose your working class base when you raise them into the middle class, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and that's also why it's so important to have alternative ideas about basically pensions and Social Security.
Mm.
That if home ownership is the way that most people in this country see themselves as being able to live after their body is able to labor and people are able to sell their labor power, then of course they're going to be extremely defensive about property values and be susceptible to stupid racist ideas that integrating your neighborhood if you're white is going to bring down the property values. And of course, the way that the banks operated made that true in a lot of cases. It's not some sort of a natural law. It's that once the neighborhoods got integrated enough, the banks stopped giving you refinance loans on your house if you needed to do repairs and things like that. So it's both a psychological and a structural condition that's been a changing same over the last several decades since we started large-scale subsidized home ownership in this country in a very differential way. And when we did that project, it's also worth remembering, starting in the basically as a way out of the Depression and then continuing and expanding in the post-war years, is the same years that we were doing public housing, and we spent way more money on suburban single-family home subsidies than we ever did on public housing. And eventually we drew out the money from public housing altogether and started demolishing it and never, touched the mortgage interest deduction and other things that benefit suburban single-family homeowners. So it's been this sort of dual-track policy of ensuring that housing for the poor remains, a last and worst option, as housing for the middle class becomes a sort of mostly racially defined opportunity structure.
Well, even more so. I don't know if it's even more so, but it feels like we're in an accelerated period of like people that have money, like grabbing up houses and using them to profit. And like, I wonder if, like, when you look at the bonanza that's happening in, like, I don't know, the Hudson Valley, people going middle class and upper middle class New Yorkers buying houses there and like driving prices up, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's a big story, but it's one that makes me wonder, like, and I wonder what your thought on this is like, we tend to think about the GI Bill and the building of the suburbs after World War II as this particular white, racialized project, I should put it that way. But it's also like, it was also seen as like something that allowed, a mechanism that allowed people who wouldn't otherwise be able to do so to like start obtaining and accumulating generational wealth and passing it on to their kids. And that was seen as a progressive project. But when I hear you here, I'm like kind of wondering, and I'm like, what is that? Is it a progressive idea to like put our ability to attain wealth that way for ordinary people in like the buying and selling of property? It seems like there's a scary direction there, if that makes sense. Not necessarily a progressive one.
No, and it's created the kind of politics we were talking about a few minutes ago that are very hard to unwind.
Right.
It is a way of building intergenerational wealth, but it's also a way of locking out other people from accessing it. Because if you have a system that's designed for the housing to become more and more expensive, that's how you get the intergenerational wealth. How is the next generation going to afford to buy into it? Mm-hmm. How are those who are, excluded on racial grounds going to afford to buy into it? We also have the problem then of having legit, good, non-speculative models sometimes rejected by people because they can't build wealth with it.
Right.
So we can build non-speculative housing. We know how to do it. We have examples of it. In New York City, like, there's a significant social housing sector. We don't usually talk about it that way, but it exists. But people are sometimes reluctant to personally enter into that kind of a system or politically to support the development of that kind of a system because there's no way to earn money off of it in the same way that a previous generation was able to earn money off of traditional homeownership, and a certain class of people is able to still.
We had a guest on last year that talked about moms for housing in Oakland.
I heard that episode.
Yeah. I mean, what's going on in New York with that type of stuff? Because, in your piece, you talk about this Honda, which is Honda, which stands for Housing Our Neighbors with Dignity Act. But can you tell me a little bit about like sort of what is the picture? So it's not all just completely bleak, because it feels like there are forces that are fighting around housing and actually winning victories.
Oh, yeah. It's actually less bleak than it has been in a long time.
Right.
So, I worked on that Honda bill, a confusing name. It's not about cars. That's the bill that converts empty hotels and offices into permanently affordable housing. And we did pass that at the state level, and we can pass that at the state level because there's been a substantial transformation in the composition of the state legislature over the last few years. We have DSA endorsed self-described socialists in both the state Senate and the state Assembly. We have Democratic majorities in both, so they actually have a little bit of power. And we have a governor right now who's scared. So this is Hochul, took over after the odious Cuomo, doesn't have quite as strong a grip over the legislature as Cuomo did, and really wants to get reelected and will need New York City votes. And so there is actually a political opportunity and some of the mechanisms to pull it off. And we also have a very strong tenant and homeless movement that's organized statewide that has been kind of on a march since 2019, when we passed the strongest rent laws in maybe 50 years in New York City, which made the rent stabilization system much stronger, also added eviction protections statewide, benefited people in mobile home communities. Like, it was a really comprehensive piece of legislation. We got the eviction moratorium following that during the pandemic, a massive rental assistance program to repay people. We didn't get to cancel rent, but we did get $2.5 billion to go towards back rent. So the next things that people are pushing for are even stronger rent and eviction protections statewide. So not just in New York City, but everywhere. A clean and easy way for people to get out of the shelter system. We have 92,000 homeless New Yorkers, and it is much less expensive for the city and state to pay for them to live in decent housing than it is to keep them in substandard shelters. And yet that's what our system is designed to do. And we also want to kill 421A, that gigantic tax break, which is the single biggest tax expenditure in New York State. It's the thing we spend the most on in terms of housing, is subsidizing luxury housing.
Unbelievable.
$1.7 billion last year.
So it's like the social engineering that's going on is through these real estate policies.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the mechanisms of capitalism right now are also through urban real estate. This is the kind of key intervention I tried to make in Capital City, is that, yes, when we talk about housing costs, you have to think about supply and demand for limited space, and you have to think about the cultural dimensions of people wanting to live in particular places and the economics of, where is the job growth. All of that stuff is real and true. But there's also this elephant in the room, which is that global capital is investing tremendously in urban housing with the expectation of substantial profits. And as long as that's the case, relatively weak city governments are going to be competing with each other for that capital and using their planning systems to make it a value proposition for international real estate capital. I don't say international here to say that, some capital is better than others. It's just a fact that's happening in cities around the world, not just in New York City.
Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to ask about. We started thinking about your book as this book from the 70s, Capital City, because it feels like something that could have been written at any moment in the history of New York City. You could have called it Capital City. So I guess I'm wondering, what do you mean what do you mean specifically when you call it Capital City in the 21st century? How is it different from what New York has always been, which has been a place for big money to make more money, a place that sort of primes the pump for capitalists to accumulate?
Totally. Yeah, there was another book that I think is about the banking and finance history of New York that's called Capital's Capital.
Right.
So it's not that the entrance of capital to New York City is any kind of a new thing or capital dominating the politics. It's also not that real estate being powerful is a news story. I think what's important to note is the decline of other modes of capital accumulation in New York City relative to real estate. So the most simple version of this is manufacturing and real estate as two different modes of turning the physical space of the city into a place to make more money. And for a long time, New York City capitalists did both, not necessarily the same capitalists, often different ones and in competing ways. So folks who are interested in industry, for example, might have had an interest in the land being relatively cheap because they don't make money off of the land itself. They make money off of the thing that they make on top of the land. And they might have even supported certain kinds of affordable housing because they saw that as a check against their workers demanding higher wages. So, if rents are controlled, then the rents aren't going to skyrise, aren't going to shoot up. And the workers aren't going to come to the boss demanding higher wages, or else they won't be able to live within commuting distance of the city. Meanwhile, real estate capital wants the opposite of both those things, right? It wants the value of land to go up, at least after it's bought it. And it wants as few checks on their ability to raise rents as possible. But they might want some other things that manufacturing capital was against, right? They might be for certain kinds of restrictions on polluting, because the more polluted the area is, the harder it is to sell housing nearby. And the support for zoning initially was to keep industry away from housing. And so there was this structural conflict between different kinds of capitalists over the planning system in New York City and in many other places. So then when you have the large-scale deindustrialization of New York City, starting as early as like shortly after World War II and then accelerating a lot in the 70s, you have these vacuums open up. You have a spatial vacuum, right? Space that can now be converted from industrial to high-end residential. And that's how you get Soho, for example. You also have an economic vacuum. How is this city going to make money now? Well, it used to be, in large part at least, through manufacturing, through warehousing, through transportation, all this sort of dirty stuff. That's not happening so much anymore. Real estate, finance, insurance, these things become the kind of dominant ways of making money, and this related service industries become the main way of employing people. And then finally, and most importantly for my argument, there's a political vacuum that opens up. Whereas before there was a fight between different kinds of capitalists over what the planning priorities of the city was going to be, and maybe workers and workers' parties could use the fact that capital was divided to push a certain kind of agenda. Now you have real estate and finance essentially aligned toward a model of urban planning that's going to make the city more and more expensive. And yeah, they might need to preserve a little bit of public housing to keep the workforce, but maybe they can make money off of that as well. And so that's the rise of what I'm calling the real estate state.
Yeah, it's so ugly, and the idea that the manufacturing class had some sort of different investment and different interest in building the city is really, really fascinating, because it's something that I felt while I was living there was just sort of like this financialization of the city, the service economy being the only thing that's happening. So like when you're in Manhattan, you're like in all these businesses that are being that have workers in them that are people of color that live in the Bronx and that like take the train for an hour and a half to come work at some shitty Manhattan service job. And I always thought to myself, like, what is the point of any of this? It seems very unsustainable. Like none of this seems like it's creating any. It seems like something at the end of its of its operation, or it's whatever it's intended to be doing. But I wonder what you think about, like, because your book came out right like before COVID really came and launched us into a maybe different historical moment. But
I see that one coming.
Yeah, I wonder, like, because I mean, to us, one of our theses on nostalgia trap, and it's not necessarily an original one, but that COVID sort of is an accelerant to a lot of these phenomenon. Do you think that's true, or are there surprising things that are happening along this line of New York City being this really vapid center of capital, as you've described it?
Well, I don't think it's a vapid center of capital. I fucking love the place. I'm never leaving.
Yeah.
You know,
Hey, I'll probably come back one day. I think that's there's a weird draw to New York, whether it's the good times or bad times in New York City. It always seems like and I think that's part of why you get so depressed about these sorts of things, because it's sort of like you're attacking a place that's special.
Yeah, yeah. And there's almost 9 million people in New York City, and like 1 million of them suck. But that's like 8 million pretty cool people still.
I don't know. I'd put the number a little bit higher. This is a Seinfeld conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
What percentage of people are total assholes?
And I want to say one other thing before answering the question about acceleration, which is that I want to make clear that I'm not saying that manufacturing capital was good.
Yeah, no, I think I get
right?
that.
I know that you do, but there are people who say like, well, that was when we used to make stuff, and those were, dignified work and everything else, and like those were the people who put us all in sweatshops and exploited the hell out of us too. It was just useful that they had a different vision of the city than our landlords.
Well, that's a very reactionary view too. Like the Frank Sabatka on The Wire being like, "We used to build shit in this country," like. But it's funny because I think about tech too, and I'm in the middle. I'm now where I didn't get you to answer that previous question, but we can get to it because if you throw tech in the mix, like where is tech when it comes to New York City? I mean, Amazon was basically told, don't come here. I know that Amazon is still going to be in New York one way or the other, but not with its HQ2. Is that what it was? But I think about it because, we talk a lot on the show about sort of like where the hipsters are and where like the young people are. And like that vision, you mentioned Soho, like this sort of era of New York City where young artists are able to go live in some abandoned factory loft. It seems like just a fantasy now, a nostalgic fantasy. But when I think about tech, that's what I think about young people with money, like young, and I think of Los Angeles and San Francisco and maybe even Atlanta. It's like places where like there are big tech companies and a lot of middle class employees that are young and have money and are buying houses, and New York doesn't really have that level of tech. It seems like as these other cities.
Well, I think California and Washington State maybe are in the lead. New York coming up fast behind, and Bloomberg, de Blasio, and now Eric Adams have all said that they want to be, tech friendly and seeing that as a future growth area. And there were people blanking right now on who it was. Somebody published an op-ed in the New York Times during the Amazon debate that said, this is important because we need to diversify our economy away from finance and real estate. To me, throwing tech in the middle of that doesn't really do much to the model that I'm talking about. I don't really think that they're looking for low land values and cheap housing.
We need to save the city. Bring in Elon Musk.
That's right. Yeah, he'll bring us all to the moon. But that's another thing that's sort of accelerating is the tech buy-up of larger swaths of the city. And there's one story here that says like, Amazon didn't get all the tax breaks that they would have gotten if the housing, the HQ2 deal went through. But they're still, expanding their footprint in New York City. And sometimes the anti-Amazon folks will use that as evidence that they were right. Like, we actually don't need to subsidize them that much. They want to be here. So they're coming anyway. Facebook also bought or leased, I forget, a huge amount of office space in Manhattan. Google bought the building that they had been leasing before. So there's more and more of the big tech infrastructure. And then there's also a lot of smaller tech firms that are operating out of places like Industry City in Sunset Park.
Oh, yeah.
So that is happening, and it's accelerating now. And I think the decline in certain kinds of maybe more traditional office tenants created space for tech to move in.
That's something you brought up in your piece too, is the empty office space, which is maybe an unanticipated thing. Like the idea that all of a sudden there would be like a massive amount of empty office space in New York, and that we might not fill those back up with office workers, and that we have another sort of situation like New York has faced before, which is sort of all this empty space.
Right. 20% of Manhattan office buildings are empty right now.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, and yet we're still planning on building more offices.
Right.
which is kind of an interesting economic development and planning model. On the one hand, you can be like, well, this is built to fail. So there's a plan to finance a new or an expansion of Penn Station, the transit hub,
That's right.
on 34th Street, by building 10 new office buildings. And I'm not actually sure that will fail. Those ultra high-end office buildings do tend to get used, but it sucks those tenants out of other spaces, which then become obsolete and then usually often were tax subsidized in the first place, and then might seek a bailout. So what we get is this sort of perpetual churn of state support for the newest and shiniest commercial space for big corporations and others who are perpetually, supposedly attracting to the city, but often just moving from one place to another. Like we did Hudson Yards on the far west side. A lot of the office tenants there came out of Times Square and other parts of the older central business districts. Just creates a new crisis someplace else. But in terms of this question of accelerating, I wrote an article in Jacobin at like the 1 year mark of the pandemic. And my title of it was A Decade in a Year's Time. They changed it to something else that was maybe a little bit more click friendly, but that's how I see what happened over that year, was that a lot of things that were already happening and progressing accelerated tremendously in that year. And that some of the disaster that was COVID in New York City was also a result of things that had been happening already, such as, closing hospitals around the state, some of which were then converted into luxury condominiums. And so, we felt what would be the inevitable effects of that kind of a change consolidated in this 1 year. But I also think that there was like a tremendous amount of political mobilization that was also going on, which then accelerated tremendously. Obviously, Black Lives Matter movement and the uprisings and demonstrations, which were phenomenal in New York City. I don't know if the media covered it in the way that it felt to be out there, but it was tremendous.
I follow too many lefties on Twitter, so I get a very distorted view of what it's like, and I have no idea, because it seems like that a lot of the images from those uprisings or demonstrations just became fuel for reactionaries too. So I'm not sure exactly how that played out, but yeah.
Yeah, well, that got accelerated too.
Right. We're living in I love that idea of 10 years in a year, because part of me thinks like, well, the optimistic vision of that would be that a lot of the contradictions that we were going to have to just like agonizingly wait to come out have actually come out, and we can deal with them now.
Yeah, absolutely. And that hurricane that I mentioned before too.
Yes.
Hurricane Ida, that was another thing that, people were aware of how precarious New York City period is.
Right.
Given that it's a bunch of islands and peninsulas.
When my wife and I talk about moving back, I'm like, because we're sitting here, in California wildfires, and we're sitting here being like, well, do we just sit here and wait to burn to death in California, or do we move back to New York and drown in a basement somewhere? And like that idea is real, right? Like these things are happening right in front of us in a way that have nothing to do with COVID. I mean, this is climate change. That to me has been a surprising element within the larger pandemic years, has been that climate change has actually become a point of the conversation in a much larger way than it seems like it ever has been before. Yeah.
I mean, that hurricane that hit New York City was record rainfall, but the record was set a week before that.
That's right. That's like a foot, almost like a foot of rain in an hour in Central Park or something like that. It's unbelievable.
Now, anytime it rains, there's like a little bit of panic that sets in for me and for many others.
Well, I mean, living through Irene and Sandy, I was already, because I mean, I lived in Sunset Park for 8 years, and I was like up, Sunset Park is up. I was up on a hill a little bit, and so rain and flooding wasn't our worry. But then, like, you talk about Industry City and like Red Hook down there, like it was just devastated. And I thought to myself, like, wow, what a weird feeling to be living in a city where there are these zones that you kind of know are flood zones or know are vulnerable for one environmental reason or another. And that part of it is really disturbing. And it seems like, to me, my feeling was always one that, I think you write about really well, which is the feeling of like kind of who is in charge of what's the direction of the city right now. And it seems like when you see like the stuff like these thin towers going up and nothing else happening, it can be really distressing because it feels like the only forces that are shaping this city are the ones that are making money.
Yeah, yeah. I wrote a piece called Unplanned by Design that was kind of asking the question of like, do we have a climate plan? And I was looking into it, and the answer is like you could say enthusiastically, yes, we have 20 climate plans. But when you have 20 climate plans and they kind of contradict each other, and we're still doing intensive development in the floodplain, and we're buying out people from one stretch of Staten Island as we're not fixing up the public housing in Red Hook, really begs the question of like, maybe we don't have a plan for this after all. And when there is no plan and when there is no mechanism to plan comprehensively, then the strongest arm of capital is going to sway the direction of planning. And I think that's what we've seen for a long time.
Well, and capital loves crises, so that's part of what scares me too. Is that you don't like wait for some shocking event to happen and then capital learns something and like fixes it. Capital learns how to profit off of it, and that part of it is what's distressing too. And it makes me wonder, like, at what point is there a mass politics that's capable of understanding that and intervening on it effectively? I guess that's the question. That's the big question of our time, I guess.
And how are we gonna survive the crises, let alone overcome them?
Yeah,
and that does become a challenge as people are more and more sort of individualistically seeking their own salvation in the midst of some really scary shit.
Yeah,
and getting people to act collectively in that time is an extra challenge.
The election of Eric Adams is such a trip. The election of like he's sort of an anachronistic figure, right? Like there's something enigmatic about him, and so it's hard to say like where any of that will go. But what's your read on Eric Adams? He seems like someone who sort of seems to know where power lies in the city. He seems like he comes off to me as a smart dude, but also like sort of like I said, enigmatic. I'm not exactly sure where he's at with any of this.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think people have been asking the question, is he more like de Blasio or is he more like Bloomberg? And I think he's more like Giuliani and Koch together.
Interesting.
He's like a New York character.
Yes, totally.
He's
he's so recognizable. Like 100% when I see him talk and I like all the new age stuff, the yoga, everything, I'm like, having ridden the bus in New York City for as many years as I did, I recognize this guy. It doesn't surprise me that he would win.
Yeah. And like the weird contradiction somehow makes sense of like being the macho guy who also says that he takes baths with flower petals. It's a type.
Is this just going to be how our politics are now? We're just going to have like weird people, just kind of odd. It seems like, I mean, maybe that's what flux is, and that's what it is to like live through a transitional moment of, and I don't know what we're transitioning to, but it's a wild moment. I mean,
right, and it's worth noting that the Republican candidate was an even more extreme character.
Right, it was Curtis Sliwa with his cats.
Exactly.
Who was a guy I ran into on 34th Street all the time, and just thought of as like, oh yeah, I remember that guy from the '80s with his like, he's like this, the whole guardian angels thing. Seems like a relic of a totally different moment in New York City. And yet here he is running for mayor and like getting a lot of attention. It's insane.
Getting a third of the electorate. Yeah.
We had the rent is too damn high guy though, in 2010. And I'm still like, I used to run into that guy all the time. I feel like,
he came to all the protests.
Yeah. And I was like, I think he ended up being like a Trump supporter or something, but, I mean, rent is too damn high is kind of what I wanted to talk to you about, Sam Stein. Because like that's why, like that to me, like that's the story of the city is rent is too damn high. And as much as he was laughed off the stage when he ran for mayor and all the different candidates,
he ran for governor, so he was on stage with Andrew Cuomo. I think there was possibly a sex worker who was running on a cannabis legalization.
Man, that sounds like the Schwarzenegger recall in California so many years ago. Where
right.
Gary Coleman, porn stars, just whatever. Throw them all out there.
So maybe this isn't as new as it seems, but I do think that like people were basically bored by de Blasio.
Yeah, definitely.
In a way that was, pretty bad. as a public reaction, like both in not noticing how bad some of the things he was doing were, but also not noticing like how good some of the things he was doing were, and basically just missing the point and allowing the guy to trip himself up at every step.
Well, he murdered a groundhog. Let's not forget. I don't know if you.
Never forget.
Never forget the groundhog. What I wonder, what are the things we should remember about De Blasio that are good things that he accomplished? Because I think you're right in terms of like it's kind of like the infrastructure bill, where like the infrastructure bill like is going to be this extraordinary thing, but nobody gives a fuck about it, and like that's like kind of sort of weird because it's like the infrastructure bill is weirdly like a historic thing for like a progressive sort of vision. I mean, it's sad in the sense that we haven't worked on our infrastructure in decades, so we passed something. It's amazing, but it is at the same time. And I feel like De Blasio is maybe a character like that, where you're kind of like, what did we miss about De Blasio?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that everybody says is universal pre-K, and that's totally true. He ran on it. He did it. He didn't get it funded the way that he said he would, which is a tax on millionaires, but that's really Cuomo's fault, not his.
Yeah, that was in the Ross Barkan episode. We talked about Cuomo humiliating De Blasio over the pre-K thing. It's so fucked up.
Yeah. What a time to be alive. But he did the thing, and you could argue that it was like a significant post-neoliberal, anti-neoliberal, non-neoliberal, whatever you want to say, form of governance to actually expand the public sector and make it universal and spend a bunch of money doing it. In my realm of things, of like planning and housing, there's a lot to fight the guy about. And I spent the last 8 years fighting him from the left. But we also had several years of rent freezes in rent stabilized housing, which we've never had. No other mayor has put together a rent guidelines board, which is the publicly appointed group of people who vote on the rent change in rent stabilized housing, which is about half the private housing stock in New York City. And I forget if it was 3 or 4 years, no rent increase at all. I think it was 3. That's amazing.
Yeah.
That saved a lot of people a lot of money. So of course, once we got that rent freeze, our demand in the tenant movement immediately became rent rollback,
right?
which we didn't get. But like, we've been saying rent freeze for decades.
Do you think that could have happened under Bloomberg or no?
No.
That
the mayor appoints the board, and they appoint the kind of board they want to evaluate the data in the way that they want to evaluate it.
Yeah.
Which doesn't mean that the mayor has an iron fist to control it, but if you get to choose who's on it, you're going to have, it's like jury selection. Like you can make things go in the direction you want them to go. And De Blasio appointed people who I would say fairly evaluated the data and say, the rent hikes have been unjustifiable for a long time. We're going to slow this down now. And yeah, landlords, you might, your expenses might have gone up last year, but we raised it 7% in previous years. And there was no justification for that. So you're going to have to take your savings and spend them to cover you for a little while. That was pretty much unthinkable in the Bloomberg years, and I don't see it happening necessarily under Adams, who seems more rhetorically concerned with the plight of the small landlord, who does not generally own rent-stabilized property, than he does with the million rent-stabilized apartments.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to keep you too long, but I know I did want to ask you about that. Maybe this can be our last thing, because it goes along with the whole homeowner settler culture, like the fucking psychological propaganda element of this. But like the mom and pop landlord, the image of like the mom, Eric Adams seems to lean on that idea a lot. How realistic is that in terms of like determining the sort of living conditions and living costs for New Yorkers? I don't know how much you know about like outside of New York in terms of that, but it seems like there might be differences between New York and the rest of the country when it comes to that stuff. But the image of the mom and pop landlord seems like a very common way of expressing exactly what I was saying earlier, which is this progressive vision of families who are sort of using their home to gather, accumulate wealth and invest further. And there's something really plucky and American about that, it seems like.
Yeah. Also very strongly gendered.
Yeah.
And this is a dynamic I've wanted to spend some time thinking about, but haven't written about yet. But like mom and pop.
Yeah. Right.
What the fuck is that in
Yeah.
the first place?
Heteronormative as well.
Heteronormative, old-fashioned idea that doesn't really exist in New York City all that much.
Who the fuck is pop anyway?
Who is
Jesus.
pop? Right.
Yeah. But they do
Around
it.
the
They do
country-
it with they do it with businesses too, right? The mom and pop
Yeah.
business. I
Mom
mean,
and pop small business,
that's still the cliche on like the NBC presidential primary debates. Joe Biden will be talking about that stuff.
Yeah. And there's a lot I can say about this. First of all, outside of New York City, the dynamics really are different. Small landlords are far more common in places that aren't New York City, San Francisco, LA, Chicago, big cities like that.
I rent from the house you're looking at right now. I rent from a family who, I'm putting their kids through college.
Mom and pop.
Yep.
Yeah. In New York City, it's a small and diminishing population, but it's also term of art is a polite way of saying it, but like, what counts as a mom and pop landlord? Is it, a household who owns a home and lives in it and rents out, one of the floors as an apartment? That's one thing. Is it somebody who owns a home but then also owns another home and they rent that one out to tenants? Is it a person who owns, a handful of buildings? All of these things, somebody considers a mom and pop landlord compared to like Blackstone, the world's largest landlord, which has its headquarters in New York City. So,
Right.
If your point of comparison is Blackstone, then a lot of like what I would consider, mid-sized slumlord operators also get to call themselves mom and pops. As an organizer, some of the worst housing conditions I've ever seen were tenants who lived in small, non-owner occupied buildings whose landlord didn't own much property.
Interesting.
The reason for that is the landlord doesn't have a ton of capital. They don't have rents coming in from another building that they can use to cross-subsidize. They also don't live in the building. So as the conditions deteriorate, they don't suffer. So, there's a real grim side to the mom and pop landlord story that doesn't often get included. They're also often very reluctant to take housing vouchers because to do so, you have to give your tenants a certain degree of rents higher than, degree of protections, rent protections than you would otherwise. And also you have to pass inspections, which they don't want to go through. So these aren't necessarily our like civic heroes in all cases, though some of them do actually rent housing for less than market rate because they have something of a conscience and they know the tenant and they don't want to screw them over entirely. So there's a wide swath here. But the most important thing is in the New York City context, when it comes to like rent stabilized operators, they're a very small percentage, and yet they are the only ones who come and testify to the Rent Guidelines Board crying poverty. And they're the ones that the mayor-elect has chosen to focus on in his rhetoric, saying, I'm not going to freeze rents unless I can freeze mortgages for the mom and pop landlords who own rent stabilized housing.
This class of people really likes to victimize themselves, just like the mom and pop employers. And it's a similar thing. Hearing you say that about like the idea of like a small business actually, the employees being somehow even more screwed over by working for those places is an interesting one. Yeah.
I before I was in the housing movement, I was in the labor movement, and the way unions see markets is really interesting and is maybe not the same as how non-labor affiliated left progressive types think that unions see markets. So the union that I worked for, they didn't want competition, they wanted monopoly, and they wanted to have one master contract with that monopoly that guided the wages and benefits for the entire sector. And they hated the mom and pops. For them, it was like a small company that was anti-union to the core and paternalistic about their employees and doesn't even have the money to pay more in wages and benefits. And from their perspective, should basically be taken over by the competition who we should unionize. I'm not necessarily saying I endorse that view fully, but it's an interesting, different way of looking at it than the nostalgic view of the small business owner as the hero of American capitalism.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And that small business owner and that small mom and pop landlord seem like the petty bourgeois base of Trump. Honestly, like those are the people that are have a real sense of entitlement when it comes to like being able to keep as much of their money as possible. I had a mom and pop landlord in my last place that I left. I left during the pandemic because he showed up one day, this landlord, mom and pop, dude in his like cargo shorts and baseball cap. What's up, bro? That's how he talks. Like, what's up, bro? And he comes by. He knocks on the door. Hey, what's up, bro? Just letting California. He's like him and Holly. He's having this sort of like uncomfortable talk, and he's like, California's being really, really mean to landlords right now. He's like, it's just really sad. And I just wanted to ask you if I could raise your rent because we're having a hard landlords have it really hard right now. I had just that morning lost one of my adjunct teaching jobs, so I was in no mood to hear this. And I just told him, look, I just lost one of my jobs. We're in the middle of this pandemic. You have a lot of nerve coming here and asking if you can raise my rent and telling me that landlords are having a hard time. Okay. I'm sorry. He's like one of those kind of a meek guy, but he said
I'm
to me,
imagining the guy from The Big Lebowski, the landlord.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's totally him. He was like wringing his hands, and he's like, and he says to me, "This is the nerve of what he says to me." And like, I'm sitting there like having like Karl Marx exploding in my mind because he's like, if you do get another job though, can you let me know, and then we can negotiate raising rent. And I was like, in my head, I'm like, so you're saying if I find another fucking job, you have a right to a certain portion of it, and like that's just that. And that to me just enraged me. And I told him we're not living in it here anymore. And we gave him a month notice, and we found another mom and pop, seemingly nicer group of people. But I mean, nice doesn't really have anything to do with it, honestly. It's just like what they're allowed to do and what the culture okays them to do. But to me, like what you're describing here in your work, Sam, is so important because it gets at sort of the mechanisms by which these things exist and continue and allow people like that to think that they're just mom and pop landlords, investing for their family. By the way, this guy has 18 properties in the city. Just wanted to throw that out there.
The mamas and the papas.
Yeah, well, it's actually his mom. He's like, my mom is the one that had property from before, and she gave it to me, and then we've been expanding ever since. And I'm like, and you're asking me to like give you $100 extra a month from like the shitty job I have. It's just like it's a little hard to swallow, dude.
Some of the irony too is because he basically pushed you out, he doesn't get repaid for the rent he lost. I don't know if you didn't pay rent for a period, but the tenant needs to still be there for the federal programs to repay the rent, which was supposed to be, among other things, a disincentive for landlords to evict people. Like, if you want to get paid, you're going to have to keep that tenant there. But instead, landlord basically screwed himself by pushing you out.
Yeah, and I mean, you can really. I'm thinking about now, like looking at the tower on 57th Street being built, and sort of all the injustice and all the anti-democratic ideas that are embedded in that, and then my landlord being on my front porch, saying I need to raise your rent. Like those things are connected, and they have like a different like intimacy to them. But both of them are sort of ways that we can like understand a little bit of the dynamic thing you're describing here.
Yeah.
There
was a guy, Tito Delgado. He's still around in the Lower East Side. He might not have come up with this, but he said it to me. They're not the lords of the land; they're the scum of the earth.
That should be the name of the title of this episode. I'm also going to be thinking a lot about like Robert Moses with Jane Jacobs' tendencies. There's something really odd because I like that. There's something to think about there for me because I don't even know if I think of those two as like binary. You know what I mean? Like Jane Jacobs and Robert Moses as being necessarily different things, even though I know they fought over like Washington Square Park and whether they should, like Robert Moses wanted to build a freeway through Washington Square Park at some point. And so Jane Jacobs is the hero of that whole thing. And you can watch a lot of like really nice little PBS videos about Jane Jacobs. And I think that's where people get that idea that she's some sort of crusader against that type of growth and investment.
I mean, she was.
Yeah, no, totally.
Yeah.
But there's also like, I don't know, it's a complicated legacy. We'll put it that way.
Totally. And part of the thing that Scott Larson argues in the book is that there were some shared assumptions between the two of them, which we might want to get away from if we don't want another Bloomberg.
Right. I guess that's what I'm saying is aren't Moses and Jane Jacobs maybe closer figures than that binary expresses, if that makes sense.
Yeah, certainly Lenin's outside of that binary.
I do. I think you're probably right about that. Sam Stein, I really appreciate you sitting and spending some time with me. The housing thing is mind-boggling, honestly, and it seems like we've said it here. But every time we do a housing episode on Nostalgia Trap, I'm like, this is the terrain of the future. This is where the fight is, and it seems like it. And I don't know what the Adams era will give us, but I hope it's something new.
It's gonna be weird. You know that much. Thanks so much, David.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Well, all right. I want to thank Sam Stein for coming on the program. That was a really fun conversation. I hope you learned as much as I did. And go check out his book. It's called Capital City, Gentrification and the Real Estate State. Really, really compelling stuff. So thanks, Sam, for coming on the program. Also wanted to make you aware that our movie club is starting this Friday, November 19th. If you haven't signed up, you can do so at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And if you join up, you get all our bonus episodes and everything else. We really, really appreciate our supporters on Nostalgia Trap. Thanks so much, and we will talk to you very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.